Good evening, good afternoon. It might be morning where you are. You may be watching this live or you may be watching it as it's recorded. I'm Kathy Callahan-Howell with the Justice Network of the Free Methodist Church. And we're excited today to have Dr. Amelia Cleveland-Traylor with us. Welcome, Amelia.
Thank you so much.
Amelia serves our denomination as one of the superintendents of the River Conference. And when I say doctor, sometimes clergy have a Doctor of Divinity degree or a DMin degree or a PhD, but she is actually a medical doctor. Both Amelia and her husband, Michael, were in the medical field before they became clergy and began serving in that way. And I just want to say thank you to Amelia because she serves as an OBGYN, and in particular, the Black women of the country suffer a lot from medical care and insufficient medical care, especially maternity care. So we're glad that she's out there doing that. And you can pray for her because besides the usual, she and Michael live now in San Antonio and they're having quite the outbreak of COVID. So she's really out there in the front line. So stay safe, and we are praying that God will take care of you in that way.
Amen.
Amelia previously was, you hopefully saw her in the Conversation of the Bishops. There's been 2 of those. And during the first one, Amelia began that conversation with something she didn't want to hear. I don't want to hear this because these are some common responses. And so we're going to unpack those a little bit more today. So we'll start with this one. Racism was a problem of the past. Isn't it time for us to just move on? So Amelia, you want to take that one and run with it?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Kathy. It's a privilege really to join you all today. I always have this disclaimer, and of course I warned Kathy I was going to say this before we got started, and that is, I want you to know that I'm a single voice. I'm a single voice that definitely has an opinion about many things, but I'm not claiming particular expertise with race management and race relations in the country. I certainly have my experiences of a lifetime, and I do think that I speak for the majority of people, but I absolutely don't speak for all. So take my words with a grain of salt, if you will, but I would challenge you at least to use them as fodder, if you will, to expand your own thinking and to tackle some of these very sensitive issues. If you've ever known somebody who suffers from an addiction, excuse me, you know that there is little hope of their being cured or making progress in overcoming their addiction until they actually recognize that they have an addiction. Every AA meeting starts with sharing, and each person that stands at the podium invariably says, "Hello, my name is," and I am an alcoholic. I really feel like until Americans get to a place where we can say, hello, we are Americans and we have a problem with racism, that the chances of us making truly significant progress that's going to change not only us right now, but future generations, if we don't get to the point where we can recognize that this is a problem, then we're actually doomed to continue to repeat the problem. We can't ignore what already has been there for a really long time. Racism is actually not unique to the United States. I mean, it's a problem throughout the entire world. And in my humble opinion, I think it's an integral part of our fallen sin nature, that we try to distrust, abuse, or separate ourselves from others that are different. And this idea of our fallen nature offers us an explanation of our problem, but it doesn't offer us an excuse for our behavior. So I want to make that part clear as well. You know, American slavery began about 400 years ago in this country. And you all know already that as a whole, enslaved persons were not thought of as completely human. And many people treated them either as subhuman or animalistic, or even like pets to some degree, if someone could do something particularly well. And so I want you all to recognize that the Emancipation Proclamation changed the law, but it didn't change people's minds and it didn't change people's hearts. I wish a law had the power to do all at one time, but in fact, it doesn't. And so I really feel that if someone in 2020 genuinely believes that there's not a problem with racism in the country, that they're either truly isolated or they're completely insulated. And both of those are a problem to dealing with the problem. Many laws within the United States were actually written to criminalize Black behavior. I'll give you a simple example that goes way back in time. After slaves were emancipated, there's a point in time in which it was illegal to be unemployed. And so many people who didn't have a job after they were set free were then essentially made indentured slaves to the plantations they'd just been freed from. And then they'd have no recourse or no way of actually getting out of the burden of the system that they were already in. They were just given a new name. And if you look at issues, even with the way that we attack the war on drugs or war on crime, invariably the behavior of Blacks in the country has been criminalized more. And there's even evidence that Blacks committing the same crimes as whites will almost always get a longer sentence or a more severe punishment. The fact of the matter is that racism is actually woven into the American fabric. It's a part of who we are. It's how the country was made to see people differently. And if we want to spend time talking about entertainment and sports and news, there's just evidence everywhere throughout our society that Black people are seen different than other people. And so racism is alive and well.
Thank you, Amelia. It gives a really good background for the conversation today. And one of your other statements you didn't want to hear was, I'm not a racist and I haven't done anything wrong, which really feeds right into what you just shared.
Absolutely. I mean, no one wants to be called a racist. Absolutely don't want to be called a racist. And when people hear the term racist, most of the time they think of the most extreme person. They think of the person in the white sheets, and they think of the person who is just shouting all kinds of obscenities or inflammatory remarks. They go directly to that extreme. But the fact of the matter is, there's a whole spectrum of behaviors and systems that are racialized that are still equally problematic. The bigger issue sometimes is that well-meaning people tolerate racist behavior in other people. It's the time that you're at your family gathering or you're at the picnic or you're at the park and someone just starts saying all kinds of god-awful things. And instead of that moment being one where you correct and speak out against something like that, you let it slide. Or maybe you even think it's funny. I mean, you see that it's inside racial humor. You know that particular comment couldn't be made in a different setting, but nonetheless, it's one of those things that gets a smile or a wink. And, there are things that are more systemic. We've talked about ideas of redlining, where there are certain communities essentially that were insulated from allowing any person of color to buy a home. We talk about the ways that we tolerate districting for even voting, where you put all Black people into one district so that they can only have a limited voice and not expand further. And that way the impact of their vote is actually lessened, or you change what are the requirements for actually voting on a different day. You close some polling places so that 5,000, 6,000, some ridiculous number of people are all trying to vote in one location on one day in circumstances that don't allow them to participate. We continue to make public schools funded by property taxes, which always means that poor neighborhoods have bad schools. And if bad schools and education is what everyone has to look forward to, then there's always a disadvantage to the people who are growing up in those particular environments. And we're naturally aware of a number of these things happen, but we don't do anything about it. We're certainly not being proactive. And so sometimes our passive guilt is as damaging as anything else. And so, it's not to say that we're doing the worst of racist things, but we're benefiting from many of the racist policies that have existed for a really long time.
Yes, I've appreciated what even Kendi says, that if you're not anti-racist, then you're racist. And we just need to kind of change the understanding of it, that, we've grown up with these ideas, and without even intending to, often without malice, we participate in the system or make comments that we don't realize how hurtful they are. So especially those of us that are white need to really think about that.
Well,
You also did.
I'm sorry. One of the other things that I would add to this is that many people believe that if they don't intend to be racist, that means they're not being racist. And it absolutely is possible to not intend to be racist, but be racist nonetheless.
Yes.
There are times when you don't intend to harm, but you actually do harm anyway. And of course, that's the difference between involuntary manslaughter and premeditated murder, but dead is still dead.
Right.
And so, I want people to understand that this is way more complicated than what your intention is. We all have to dig a little deeper to examine and critically examine, truly critically examine the things that we do and the things that we say and the things that we tolerate.
Yes, and sometimes, different people are offended by different things. Like you said, you're only one voice. And so we might think, this person wasn't offended by that, so why are you offended by that? Which kind of leads to another one of your questions or one of your comments. I have a Black friend, or I know a Black person, and they say something completely different.
Well, I think it's time for us to recognize that Black people are not monolithic. That even in the time of slavery, there are statements that you could make that were applicable to the big picture and to many people, but there were always exceptions. There were the people who did get to live within the houses, or had the better positions, or were allowed to learn to read, or a whole host of things. Perhaps they were some of the biracial people who got more favors because they just looked different than everybody else that was on the plantation. And so if you were to ask that person what their experiences are like or what they would recommend for others, you might hear a completely different story or approach than what you would get from the person that was having a more typical experience. So I don't doubt that there are differing voices out there, but I still challenge us to be bigger picture people. What's truer of the average person as opposed to the exceptional person? Sometimes people will say, well, we can't be racist anymore because we had a Black president, right? That's a favorite one. And quite frankly, Barack Obama is exceptional by everybody's standard. Whether that's Black or white or whatever, when you look at the Ivy League degrees and all that he's accomplished at a relatively young age, there aren't that many men who can claim that they were president of the United States, right? Because we're on number 45 now out of billions of people around the world. That's a horrible example. That doesn't prove that racism doesn't exist. It just proves that Barack Obama is very special. And so we really shouldn't get caught up in that when what we're talking about, what's true for the average person, the common person. And so I don't discount what your friend says. I just say that there's more to be said than what your friend alone has to say.
And so I think as white people, it's important that we believe when someone tells us they're offended, instead of just saying, well, so-and-so isn't offended by that. I often liken it to, you might comment on someone's weight and someone might think it's funny. They might think it's funny if you call them fat. Ha, then someone else will really be wounded by that. So you can't just make those comments without understanding that it could still be offensive. Another one of the comments you didn't want to hear was all lives matter or blue lives matter. You want to speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, there's no way to argue with the fact that all lives matter. There absolutely isn't. But here's what I would say. Every person wants to feel like they matter. Everybody wants to feel like they are loved. Everybody wants to feel like they are valued. And everybody wants to be heard. And the problem with the response of everybody, all lives matter or blue lives matter, is that in the moment, it's almost universally a response to Black Lives Matter. It's the retort, if you will. And the really biggest problem is that throughout American history, Black people have been shown or told that they are less. They're less than. They don't belong. They're less attractive. They're not as beautiful. They're not as intelligent. They're told basically to shut up and do what you're told. That's the message and the code that is there in all of the statements that are being made. So American culture has focused so much on individualism that they just don't want to see the repetitive patterns of the repeat patterns of Black lives being lost at the hands of law enforcement. They don't want to see that over and over and over again that there are legitimized terrible excuses for why it was okay in that moment for a person of color to lose their lives. You know, there's always the get out of responsibility card, the one that usually says I was either afraid for my life or this person resisted arrest. If either of those things are true, then pretty much anything that the policeman wants to justify in the moment becomes okay. And so people are dying. And so the problem for African Americans watching the news at all, or just paying attention to what's going on, is that this is happening so frequently that we have to say there must be something systemically wrong that this pattern of behavior is acceptable, excusable over and over and over again. So it isn't that, you know, the declaration of Black Lives Matters means that Black lives are to be made more important than other lives. Once again, what we're saying is we would like for the playing field to be leveled. We would like for there to be true equality. We would like for there not to be excuses to kill and harm folks. And the other thing that really matters is that we stop convicting people killed by police in the court of public opinion. You know, invariably what happens is George Floyd dies. The next thing you know, you've heard about everything that's ever gone wrong in George Floyd's life. You know, his employment history, his role as a parent, just pick anything. And then, of course, the sidebar is, oh, by the way, they were concerned that the brand new $20 bill might be counterfeit. Well, it was never shown to be counterfeit, but even if it were, under the circumstances, should he be dead? The answer, of course, to that is no, of course not. So, you know, we supposedly have this law and order and justice system that says allow the punishment to fit the crime. But with Black men and Black women, it doesn't fit. And that's why people are saying Black Lives Matter. And you know, that's really the challenge of the whole thing. There's a lot of pain and a lot of hurt and a lot of anger from the repeat offenses that people are saying over and over again.
And the last of those things you didn't want to hear, Amelia, was, well, what about Black on Black crime?
Well, for me, this one is actually one of the simplest ones, because in every single culture, the persons with whom you have the greatest affinity are people like yourselves. They become the sources of your closest relationships, but they also become the source of your greatest conflict. So most white homicide victims have been killed by other white people. Most Hispanic homicide victims have been killed by other Hispanic people. And it's no different that with Blacks. Most Black homicide victims are killed by other Black people. It's not a thing. People kill each other, and they kill people like themselves most often. And so, you know, trying to talk about Black on Black crime in the midst of this conversation is just a diversion. And the fact of the matter is that American culture is violent. We Americans are violent. We don't own it, but we are. You know, until the schools were shut down for the pandemic, we were having mass shootings in the school on the regular. Once a week, once every other week or so. You know, people take guns into the schools. They own all of these guns. We have way more armed robberies. All of these crimes. It's a part of what we do in the US. but we don't recognize that compared to other first world countries, the number of violent crimes committed here is just way outpacing anyone else. And so that's a universal issue, but it doesn't detract from the problem that we're having with Black lives and police officers.
Amen. Thank you. I want to mention, I'm trying to mute myself when I have thunder here. So if you hear strange noises from my computer, I apologize.
That's quite all right.
Amelia, oftentimes in the discussions about these concerns, we mostly hear about Black men and not so much about Black women. Would you like to speak to that for just a moment?
Well, I think it's kind of an obvious answer, at least what in my mind it is. So far, we've seen way more videos of the Black men. And so I think because we are a social media community and culture, that we're addressing the things that we have seen the most. And that's Black men. I do also believe that Black men are actually harmed more often than Black women are. But then the third part of this is just a very straightforward, misogynistic world that women are just not valued as much as men are. As much as we don't want to believe that that's true, it is true. It shows up in the economics and everything else that happens. Glass ceilings and all the other things that happen. So there's no reason why we wouldn't necessarily see it under these circumstances as well. Black women are often characterized in one of two ways. They're either super strong, able to endure anything in the universe, they're going to get it done. They're the mom, they're the this, they're the that, or they're hypersexualized, right? And those particular narratives don't fit well into everything else that's happening. So I think it's numbers, coverage, and just plain old sexism.
Thank you. Another thing that you mentioned in the conversation with the bishops this second time this past week was the need to separate patriotism and citizenship from discipleship. Could you elaborate on what that would look like? If we did a better job of that, what would that look like?
Well, I want to tell you about an experience that I had a good number of years ago at an annual conference. And we were a part of the Free Methodists at the time, but during an annual conference banquet, the song I'm glad to be an American or proud to be an American was played. And people sitting at their dinner tables got up while this song was being played and literally began to raise their hands and point them toward the flag that was at the front end of the church. And I've never, ever seen that before. It was kind of stunning to me, actually, because it was a perfect example of idolatrous behavior. This worship of the flag. And I've seen and heard so many people who literally put God and country together. It's not God and country, it's God and country. And, I've met many well-meaning Christians who genuinely believe that capitalism is of God and that patriotism is of God and that certain party affiliation is of God, and that it's so deeply woven together that they are no longer able to think critically. And so, one, I think we have to spend a whole lot more time becoming biblically literate people. I do. I think we have to become biblically literate people because there literally are no scriptures that say capitalism is the way of God. There's none. And we also have to see that there's no point in time in which God himself makes country equal to himself. I mean, think about it, even with Christ, as the disciples are trying to figure out, yes, I know you're going away and all these things are happening. They are still wondering in their mind, when are you going to come back and restore Israel to its great position? How many times did that question asked? And over again, the scripture shows us that we kept missing the mark. It was never about restoring Israel to greatness in the natural sense. It was about where they were to be in the spiritual sense. And then all those other things were going to be secondary. But as long as we are unable to see that we are Christians way before we are Americans, and that we are citizens of, a different order, we will not be able to break patterns that we're seeing. We won't be able to see outside of the box. We won't be able to entertain ideas that seem really radical. I mean, just think about how countercultural most of Jesus Christ's life was. And we praise him for that, but we don't ever challenge ourselves to be the same. That's really where he's calling us to be.
Amen. Yes, it's so hard to figure that out sometimes, how we're supposed to do that, how we're supposed to be countercultural, and when is that how we're supposed to respond. So definitely take some discipleship.
Absolutely.
I think of the new book by David Swanson, Rediscipling the White Church.
Right.
And a book is specifically about that, about how to learn what it means to be diverse. And even if you're not a church that has diversity or has any around you, so even a rural church that's in a kind of a white enclave still has things to learn. So that's one of the ideas for how to disciple would be that book.
Sure thing.
You also mentioned the other night that the image of God didn't change when previously enslaved people were released. How do you think our culture continues to fail to recognize the image of God in Black and brown people?
Well, I think every culture makes attempts to create Jesus that looks like themselves. I mean, if you do a Google search, and I've done this a couple of times just for fun, but if you do a Google search of images of Jesus, what you're going to find is that there are the blonde-haired, blue-eyed ones. And then if you find an African Jesus, he'll be dark-skinned with curly hair and dark eyes. If you go to Latin America, you'll find one that's a brown one with a different color, with maybe straighter hair, but still dark hair. There's so many ways in which we try to make Jesus a reflection of ourselves. We're all guilty of trying to make him a reflection of ourselves. So, sometimes what ends up happening is that we think of it as there's your way, and then there's the right way. Your way is your way, but my way is the right way. And as long as we are trying to make Jesus into ourselves, then it makes sense that we would reject anybody who would challenge that. And when I think about organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and that, who for so long worked so hard to kill people of color, Jews, Blacks, things like that, and then go have a worship service. That is one of those things that has always just befuddled me, because I believe they legitimately forgot that they were serving a Jewish God, that a Middle Eastern man. And like I said, we just try to make Jesus into ourselves, and we have to recognize that he's other. He's always other.
It's a good point. It's a problem when you've both dehumanized other people because of their race and then recreated Christ. So you've made the gap bigger by twice. You've made Jesus like you, and then you've made other people not even human, which is what happened really to justify slavery. So
exactly,
like a double whammy.
Exactly.
So Amelia, there's a video that's gone viral by author Kimberly Jones, and she talks about some of the recent protests, and she basically ends with this phrase, Black people are looking for equality, not revenge. And when you spoke the other night with the bishops, you mentioned Joseph's brothers, and I thought it was a great scriptural version of what she was saying. It's kind of the same point, but you made yours with the biblical story. So could you unpack that a little bit? How does that manifest in churches, do you think, the whole principle of Joseph's brothers?
Well, I think that we are all inherently afraid of change to some degree. And we see this in certain churches where, they're going to have a pastoral change. And when a new person comes on, onto staff, there's resistance to everything different that he or she might want to do, because the idea of doing things differently than before really makes them feel somehow or another that they've lost the ability for authentic worship or the way that things are supposed to be done. And it makes them very, very insecure. But I also really believe that whether majority culture wants to recognize it or not, if they want to own it or not, they recognize that the experiences of people of color, Black people, brown people, indigenous people in this country has been so bad, that their treatment has been so bad, that this becomes very much like the thing that happened with Pharaoh when he was like, whoa, there are way too many of those kind of people. If they just simply decide that they want to overthrow what's going on right here, this could be really bad for us. And so, then the enslavement got harsher, right? I'm going to keep you suppressed even more. And when I'm honest, I really believe that race relations in this country took a downturn. There's this brief blip that went forward, like hope was there when Barack Obama was elected. But I think the longer he stayed in office, the more the rumbling and the small fires that were in the background just grew and grew and grew. So that we just ultimately got to experience the perfect storm. And I do think that many in the country are afraid that if too many people of color are empowered, who get good finance, good education, are in positions of power and authority, that the first things they might want to do is pay back. And I honestly have not met anybody who thinks that way, who actually wants to pay back. But I believe that there are many people who think that. And if you combine that with the general idea that we don't like change and that we really believe that our way is the best way, it's just a fodder. It's just a fodder for a whole bunch of fear. In Brenda Salter McNeil's book on Roadmap to Reconciliation, she gives this wonderful illustration of a science teacher who had been taking students to the planetarium and who had been accustomed to looking at the universe and the stars from the northern hemisphere. And then something happened in the planetarium when they went one day and they were actually made to look at the sky from the southern hemisphere. And the wonderful illustration point was that the science teacher was completely disoriented. It's a person who made a living teaching others what was going on in the universe, but when he was forced to look at it from a different perspective, he lost his footing. I really feel that that's a real thing, that many people are hearing stories of the Black experience for the very first time, and it is literally shaking the ground that they're on because it doesn't look anything like the world they thought they were growing up in. And so now they're stuck with this really bad position of accepting, is this true, or rejecting it because it's safer and calmer for me just to be in my happy place where things have always been the way that things have always been. And so, I understand that, but we're now at a point where we can't stop telling the story.
Amelia, reminds me of a beautiful story of an older woman I knew, an older white woman who was very well off. And during the Depression, her family had a food store, so they didn't suffer. And as she aged, she was having dialysis, and she met this Black man named George, and they would sit and talk during dialysis. And so one time she was opining, the good old days. And he looked at her and he said, "Those days weren't so good for me." Mm-hmm. And she went, "Oh." And it just hit her in a way it never had before because of that relationship and because of that. That's all he said. And it just like a light bulb came on, and it was really an aha moment. It just shows the power of relationship and the power of the story. We do know, though, that more is required. And so I wanted to get practical for a minute and talk about what do we need to change systemically. It's been a thing, some white people are hearing for the first time this is a systemic problem, and hearing for the first time that housing is a problem and that banking is a problem and everything. But what about the Free Methodist Church? What do you think? Again, it's your personal opinion. But what would you like to see changed? What do you think would help us to move forward in a way that was more equitable for all of the people who are part of the Free Methodist Church?
Well, the good news is that the Board of Bishops, the outgoing Board of Bishops in 2019, put together a diversity task force. And I know that you're a member of that task force as well as a number of other people. That task force has worked really, really hard to come up with some recommendations that it's putting forth to our National Board of Administration. And so I'm hopeful that the recommendations that are being put forth are actually adopted. And I'd like to share what some of those recommendations are, at least in a brief kind of summary way. One of them is developing a theology of diversity. The Bible is literally filled with story after story that demonstrate how much God actually values all people, that in spite of the Israelites being his chosen people, that he cared for and attended to the needs of everyone around them. And he also gave them specific guidance on how they were to interact with other people. When you look at Matthew 25, when we talk about goats and sheep and how people are separated, they're being separated because of the way they chose to treat marginalized people. And that was in spite of having called upon his name and gone through all of the kind of religious rituals. I think that many church people don't recognize that they're called to do something more than simply go through the motions of Christian life. That God's calling us to a higher level. And Christ showed himself that he cared about marginalized people all the time. When he talks about that scripture in Isaiah being fulfilled in him, we're talking about addressing the needs of other people. And so I think this idea of developing a theology of diversity and of justice is actually biblical and is part of the beginning of Christian discipleship. You all also recommended that a teaching tool be embedded in the credentialing program, meaning that we started putting this into the foundation of what people are learning. What does it mean to be a Free Methodist? It's inclusive to not ignore these issues of how it is we interact with culture and with society around us. And then the third thing was, of course, making sure that we were monitoring and measuring our progress. Because as long as we just have these as high pie in the sky type ideas without actually going back to see how we're doing and adjusting what we're doing, if we're not getting the result that we like, then we really just have to make sure that we are doing something beyond lip service to this by measuring our results. So I think that's a good place to start in terms of what the Diversity Task Force has asked for. There's also a task force specifically for justice. And the Justice and Advocacy Task Force had suggested that there be an ongoing permanent part of the National Board of Administration whose job would be to continue oversight of a number of these issues. They wanted to have someone in full employ that could help basically champion the ideas. They also wanted us to make sure that we were doing what we could to help pastors that were immigrants, because the whole thing about immigration is something that we've kind of set to the side. But in reality, our pushback against immigration has been pushing back more against immigrants of color than it has been of other types of immigrants. Once in everything we're doing, we're showing that we view people of certain skin tones more than we do of other skin tones. And we of course wanted to fund and empower human resources for, like I said, for hiring practices, for teaching and things like that. And if we could find a way to integrate these ideas, let's start with the leadership. I would love to see us begin with all of the superintendents, all of the area directors, and current pastors. Because if we do this process the way I just described it, we're going to get people who are beginning the ordination process, and we'll take care of some things that are already happened, but we won't be getting the folks who are actually leading right now. So I think it's important that we address, the superintendents, the area directors, and current pastors. If we could get them to voluntarily become a part of groups that are like Build a Bridge, or we were talking before about Roadmap to Reconciliation, or Rediscipling Right Church, whatever. There's so many different tools that could, at least in theory, be used. Let's start doing that now, so that folks can start adopting these ideas, wrestling with these ideas, and hopefully growing personally. Because if we don't change what's happening from the top and move down, then we're actually going to miss out on a great opportunity. So I think those are some of the things practically that we could be working toward right now.
Thank you, Amelia. I found it encouraging. We did a little report previously about in 2015 when we had General Conference, there were hardly any leaders of color or any women.
Mm-hmm.
And we had like one female superintendent. And then by the next General Conference, we had several women, several African-American superintendents. And also, which is something the average layperson maybe doesn't pay any attention to, but the board administration changed drastically.
Yes,
now yourself and Deborah Davis Bell are both on there. It just changed to where it's very nicely balanced, both with women, with people of color. Of course, it's always got clergy and lay. That's mandated, but now it has such a wonderful variety. So I'm really happy to see that. I think that's a really great step in the right direction. I was also encouraged, some of you may have seen Bishop Emeritus Roller, David Roller's post he made. And one of the things he said was, there are times when we haven't appointed people, a woman or a person of color, to the church because we think the church isn't going to want that. And he regrets not pushing harder. And I think there are times when we're just going to have to push harder, because if these are our values, then, the Free Methodist Church has ordained women for a long time, and yet we resist putting them in churches. And the same thing with people of color. If we're like, oh, it's a white church, so we can't send that person there, then we were already changing the opportunities that are available. So we need to be willing to just move forward with considering people based on their merits and, if they're ready for that position. So I hope that.
Yeah, we absolutely have to remain purposeful and strategic. I mean, if you yourself or anyone has ever battled a weight problem, if the person tells you that their plan for losing weight is, I'm going to watch what I eat, you already know they failed, because that's not a plan. That's not a plan at all. But if they, however, say, I've decided that I'm going to consume X amount of calories, I'm going to exercise this much, I'm going to maintain a balance of this many carbs, this much fat, blah, 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 I'm going to check in with my doctor, I've got a buddy, et cetera, that's a whole different ball game. And everyone knows that weight loss is an active process. You don't, unless you're ill, that's one exception, but unless you are actively doing something about it each day, then invariably you'll fall back into the habits that are comfortable and tried and true. And that's absolutely true with what we're talking about right now. I mean, we have the benefit of being in the middle of a pandemic, right? So no one's going anywhere and everybody's on Facebook, right? That's one of the advantages, is that now what we're doing on Facebook Live and streaming has increased tremendously. But we're not going to be in a pandemic forever. And sooner or later, we're going to, quote, go back to life as usual. And if we haven't made a real quality strategic plan or of how we're going to change the Free Methodist Church, how we're going to lead in and hopefully continue to change society, so we're not continuously battling the same fights over race and gender and all of these kinds of things, then we'll fall back to what we've always done. And you and I'll have this conversation again in 22 or 23 or whatever. But nonetheless, so I think it's really important that we realize that these things don't happen by wishful thinking. Good intentions didn't build Rome, and it's not going to fix this problem. We have to have really solid strategic plans and dedication for the long run, because that's what it will take.
I love that analogy. It's very clear. I really appreciate that, because it takes something very specific, not just good intentions. Like you said, it's we have to have something concrete that we're going to do instead of what we've been doing, instead of just hoping to do better. It really has to change. It's been interesting for myself as a pastor of a diverse church for 30-something years. Some of the recent conversation about it's not just about diversity. You know, we can't just invite people in. And I heard someone today on FM radio, I think you might know him, Dr. Michael Traylor, and he was mentioning this as well, that, you know, it's not enough to just let someone in. It's not enough to just have the same church, but the faces got darker. You know, the church should change. There should be different music. There should be different concerns. We should be talking about justice issues. So it's more than that. And that's been my experience. To really have a healthy, diverse church means some changes in every way.
Absolutely. I mean, we're so accustomed to being consumers and getting what we want, if you will, that very often we select churches that cater to our specific needs. But that's not really the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is not to make you happy. It's not so that you can always have your way. And so the tension that we feel in trying to be accommodating to others and what they need. I mean, Philippians 2 is all about how we really are not to make ourselves more important than other people, how we're to consider them more than ourselves. And I believe Christ meant that literally. It's not a figurative statement. And so if we're going to make room and to accommodate for others, then invariably that means that we're sacrificing. The same way that a mother loves her child enough that she will buy the kid something new and have something very nice for Christmas, and she'll wear the same old thing that she had a long time. You don't hear moms complaining about that. You just accept that that's a concession of what it means to be a parent, right? Well, when are we going to start accepting what the concessions are that you make in order to be a healthy Christian? When will we be known by what we're for rather than what we're against? Because we have spent so much time being against this and against that and against this and against that, that no one believes that Christians are loving or that they are for anybody. So we failed. And that way we have failed. And so I'm not suggesting in any way that we're going to water down the gospel or dilute it or diminish it or anything like that. But I want us to feel the tension of the both and. Yes, we are called to be holy people, loving, and all these other kind of things, but we're also responsible to make sure that justice reigns, that mercy is present, that we are loving and kind. And that's really the whole of the best commandments, loving God and loving others. That's really what it means. Those two things are in tension all of the time. How can we love and serve God at the same time that we love and serve people?
And, you know, Amelia, when you were talking earlier about the whole issue of white people being worried, it made me think of South Africa.
Yes.
And how when apartheid ended, of course they were worried. And yet the example set by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and others was one of forgiveness. And it was, I mean, they did the right thing. They set the tone. They could have done a lot of things to punish people who had been so cruel to them, but they didn't. And that made all the difference. And so we've seen that example. And of course, it happened to be the Black people in the story that were the good guys. And so sometimes, you know, we've painted it the wrong way. So, well, we're going to wind this up, and I'm going to tell everyone what we're doing next week. But is there anything else you want to share? I want your heart to be clear. you have a final word you'd like to share in any way?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. And like I said, I want you to remember that my voice is one of many. I think that these conversations that you've heard may forever change how it is that you see me. I'm hoping that it helps you to see the issues of race and culture in the United States differently than before. I recognize that we're all on a learning curve, and that I'm certainly open to continue to grow and to facilitate the process in whatever way that I can. I really appreciate spending this time with you today. Thank you so much.
Amen. Thank you so much for being with us. And I just want to take just a moment as we close to share what we will be doing next week. And this is our new series called FM Leaders Real Talk. And what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 people on who helped to craft the statement on racism that was adopted at the last General Conference. And these 3 people authored that statement, and we want to ask them more about it. Like, how did you come up with that? Why? What were you thinking? What impact did you want it to have? And so we'll put the flyer up on that. That's Joshua Canada, Suji Alvarez, and Edward Song. So they'll be here next week, same time, same place, and we'll put the flyer on the page. So make sure that you sign up for that and come back and be ready to learn something about this process that we're all in. So thanks for being with us today. And God bless you, and continue to follow us so we can continue to just share content. We're doing our best to help you learn and help us to all grow together. As Amelia said, it's a curve, and we're on the curve together, and we want to just continue to move forward. So thank you and have a great day.